As we saw in our last video, the most important condition that needs to be met before we can say an action is morally worthwhile, is good or evil, is that it be done voluntarily. Indeed, this is what distinguishes a virtue from simply having a good disposition or a good character, you might say. Someone might naturally be a generous person. For Aristotle, that in itself wouldn't make what they do admirable or virtuous because it doesn't spring from choices they've made, from what's in their control. It's just a matter of what we might say digestion or birth. And so things being voluntary or intentional are essential for their moral worth. So now we want to talk about what it means for an action to be voluntary. And in order to do that, Aristotle believes that since this is a very complicated kind of thing, we need to first look at what's involuntary action. If we understand what involuntary is, then we can define voluntary in contrast with that. So, since he believes the negative is easier to understand, we're going to start with that. And he says involuntary action can occur under one or two conditions. You notice the word "or" there. In other words, all you need is one of these conditions to occur, and then your action is involuntary. The first is that the action is under compulsion. If it's under compulsion, then you didn't do it of your own free will. You were forced to do it, and so it's involuntary. Or you might have done it of your own free will, but thinking you're doing one thing, you do another. And that is acting in ignorance, not in full knowledge of what you're doing. If either of these conditions are met, then your action is involuntary and it loses its moral value. Or if it's a bad action, it loses its ability to be blamed or punished. So what is compulsion? Aristotle's classic example is kidnapping. Say, for example, I am in this classroom, as you know, and a man with a gun comes in and knocks me over the head with the gun. I fall unconscious, and then he takes my body, which is limb, and ties it up, carries it, puts it in the car, drives to the seashore, puts me on a ship, and the ship takes me to Greece. And at no point do I, as an individual, contribute or have control of what happens to my body. Thus, I am forced to do what I have done. I am under compulsion. This is crucial. What he's saying is that an action that is under compulsion is one where I do not, in any sense of the word, have any control of what happens to my body or what I do. So let's switch this up a little so you can see how this is different than what you and I normally think of as compulsion. Say instead that I get this call from an anonymous evil person who says, I have kidnapped your mother, and unless you go and kill President Trump, then I will kill your mother. Now, we might say that if you do that you had no choice, that what you did is under compulsion. Aristotle says, no, it's not so simple as that. You do have a choice. The question is, who do you value more? Do you value your mother or President Trump? You have no control of where your mother is, but you do have control of whether you're going to make the decision to listen to the caller and allow and save your mother's life, or to say, no, I will not kill someone even to save my mother. In this case, because the action is still to some extent under your control, we can't call it involuntary. We can't call it voluntary either, though, because the crucial thing is you wouldn't have done the action that you did of killing President Trump, presumably, had your mother not been kidnapped and had the threat not been made. So a threat might explain why what you did is not voluntary, but it can't make it under compulsion. Instead, he says what you have is this middle area what he would call non-voluntary, and there are degrees of this. What non-voluntary means then is you wouldn't have done it had the threat not occurred, so it's not voluntary, but nonetheless you had control over whether the action takes place, and so therefore it is not involuntary, it's not under compulsion. It's kind of like the idea of the lesser of two evils. It is evil to kill President Trump, presumably, and it is evil to allow your mother to die, but which evil is the greater one in relation to you? You're the one who has to decide. And thus we have these gray areas that Aristotle says make sense once we understand fully what compulsion means. It means none of the action is under your control. Literally, you didn't do it, though your body moved. Now that's one way that your action could be involuntary, but there's another way, and that is through ignorance. Now notice the word through here. What he means by through is that the ignorance is the actual cause of what you do. Whereas you might be acting in ignorance, but that ignorance isn't the cause of your action, it is the effect of some previous choice you make. So let me give an example or a difference. Say one day I feel depressed, so I go to the bar and get drunk. And now I'm so drunk, my judgment is impaired. I don't even remember or are conscious of what I do. I get into my car, I drive and speed on 400, and I smash into another car and kill everyone in the car. What I did was in ignorance. I didn't realize what I was doing. I don't even remember it. When I wake up, I don't even remember being in the car. So obviously what I did was in ignorance, but the ignorance was caused by my previous bad decision to drink until I got drunk. And so that is something which is not through ignorance. The ignorance is avoidable. If I had chosen not to drink and get drunk, then that didn't have to occur. But then there's unavoidable ignorance. Say instead that I have this sleeping disorder where I sleepwalk to a great extent and I do many things in my sleep and I have no control over it. And one day I'm sleeping, I get up in the middle of the night, I'm not awake, I'm catatonic, I get in my car, I speed on 400, and I have that accident and I kill the person in the other car. Now I'm acting through ignorance, you would say. I have no control over the ignorance itself. The ignorance is unavoidable. And so therefore, the ignorance is the cause of what I did. Had I known what I was doing, I would not have gotten into the car. I would not have sped. And I'm not the cause of the ignorance itself. And so a clue, he says, as to how we know whether this ignorance is in or through is what happens after I become conscious of what I've done. If I regret it, then what I did was truly involuntary. The ignorance caused me to do it, and I wouldn't have done it had I not been ignorant. But if after I wake up and come to my senses, I would have done it anyway, then again I'm in that gray area. Because even though the ignorance caused me to do it and the ignorance was unavoidable, nonetheless, I would have done it anyway. And so it can't properly be called involuntary. Again, it would fall into that middle area of non-voluntary action. But there is a type of ignorance that causes me to do things that's still my fault. And that is where the ignorance is caused by my negligence. So I'm driving down 400 or I'm driving on 95 and I am on my cell phone and so I miss the speed limit sign. It says 55, I'm going 65. The police officer pulls me over. I said, "Officer, I thought the speed limit was 65. I was ignorant that it had gone down to 55. The officer will say, ignorance of the law is no excuse. Why? Because the ignorance is my fault again. It was avoidable. If I had been looking up and paying attention the way I should have, then I would not have been ignorant. But let's change the scenario. Let us say instead that I'm on these Georgia back roads and that these teenagers have, with 3D printers, made fake speed limit signs. They switched these signs in the middle of the night, so now it says 65 when originally the limit was 45. I'm pulled over, but there's no way I could have known because the signs are indistinguishable. Then again, it's unavoidable. And that ignorance caused my action. I regret I wouldn't have sped had I known what the speed limit was. And thus, what I did is involuntary. So we see something very important here. We see how the line between voluntary and involuntary is a gray area. There are gradations of it. You could be more or less under compulsion. There are gradations of ignorance. You could have ignorance, but that ignorance be avoidable. You could have unavoidable ignorance, but not regret your action. And so, thus, in order to have the kind of ignorance that makes it involuntary, it has to be the unavoidable ignorance that's not your fault, that causes the action, and which you regret once you come to your senses. So now that we know what involuntary is, it's easy to see what voluntary is. Voluntary is just going to be the opposite. You have to now meet two conditions for an action to be voluntary. You have to, first of all, be the source of your action, not under compulsion, but you did it, and you willingly did it. Thus, you're the source, not external, and you had control over your action. So someone who has full control over their action is doing something voluntary if also they do it in full knowledge. The important thing here is whereas only one condition has to be met for you to have involuntary action, either of these, both conditions have to be met here in order for you to have voluntary action. Not only do you have to be the one doing the action and have control so that you could have done other than what you actually did, but what you had to have done is something that you did in full knowledge. So therefore, you know what you did and you did it. That is voluntary action. But that is not enough to have your action have full moral worth, because even children and animals act voluntarily. The difference is they do not have a choice. They do not have the reason to parse out alternatives so that then, in full knowledge of the different alternatives, they choose one alternative over the other. So thus we have to understand what choice is, because even though choice is voluntary, not all voluntary action is choice, and it is choice that is the hallmark of what makes an action morally worthy, worthwhile, and makes virtue, truly virtue and excellence, and an admirable rather than an accident of your digestion or nature.